The room was thick with warmth, the kind that lingered long after the night had faded. One More Night by Phil Collins played softly, the trumpet stretching out its last notes as if refusing to let the moment end. I lay there, still, my senses attuned to every sound. The faint creak of the wooden bed, the soft rustle of sheets, the presence beside me. Salome shifted, pressing closer, her breath warm against my shoulder. I felt the brush of her fingers against my arm, light, fleeting, like she was afraid of holding on too tightly. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about reality. Just let yourself have this. She traced a slow line along my collarbone, a quiet lingering touch. I let out a breath, my body sinking into the moment, into her. The music swelled, wrapping around us like a spell. But deep down, even as I held on to her, I knew. The next morning, the first thing I noticed when I woke up was the emptiness beside me. For a brief second, panic clawed at my chest. Had I imagined last night? Had it all been some lingering dream? Then I heard the soft rustle of fabric. I turned my head, squinting against the morning light filtering through the curtains. Salome stood by the mirror, slipping into her dress, her movements practiced, efficient. Her face was unreadable, her expression distant, so different from last night. Something inside me twisted. I propped myself up on one elbow, my voice rough from sleep. Do you really have to leave? Salome barely glanced at me. Yeah, I swallowed, trying to push down the unease growing in my chest. Why? She let out a small sigh, adjusting her sleeves before finally turning to me. Because I actually came here with Matthew. The words landed like a slap. I felt my stomach twist, my fingers clenched around the sheets. What? My voice barely carried. She sighed, already sounding tired of this conversation. I don't even know what excuse I'll give him for leaving or not coming back last night. I could barely process it. She had come with Matthew. Matthew, her boyfriend, the man she was still with. My throat tightened. You are still with him? My voice cracked. Then what was last night about? Salome turned fully to me now, her brows furrowing. The shift in her expression was so quick, so sharp, it almost made me flinch. What do you mean, what was it about? Her voice carried an edge of irritation. I blinked at her, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. I just... I shook my head, my words failing me. I don't understand, Salome. I thought... She scoffed, crossing her arms. Thought what? That we'd run off into the sunset together? That we'd live happily ever after? Her voice was rising now, laced with frustration, maybe even fear. Then she laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know how risky this is, Ruby. The room stilled. I stared at her, my breath caught in my throat. Her words hung between us, heavy, suffocating. I swallowed hard. No one's been punished for it. It's just a rule on paper. Salome's expression darkened. I'm the lawyer here, Ruby. I know how these things work. She spoke with such finality, like a judge passing a sentence. Silence stretched between us. Then she sighed. We can be together, Ruby. Just not the way you want. My stomach dropped. She took a step closer, lowering her voice as if explaining something simple to a child. We meet up once in a while like this. We can be who we truly want to be in private. And then we have a man by the side, one we can show to the world. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. A man by the side? My voice was small, hollow. You love men too, she reminded me, her tone coaxing. You've been with a man before. It's not a terrible idea. She said it like it was logical, sensible, like this was just the way things had to be. My body shook. My hands balled into fists. My nails dug into my palm so hard it almost hurt. I hate you. The words came out in a whisper, but they cut through the silence like a blade. Salome's face twitched. She blinked, tilting her head slightly. You don't mean that? No. My voice was sharper this time, shaking. I do. I threw the covers off and stood up on unsteady legs, pointing to the door. Get out. Salome just stared at me. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, to say something, but nothing came. Leave my house. My voice cracked. I don't ever want to have anything to do with you again. Leave. A tense silence filled the space between us. Then, finally, she moved. She bent down, picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she hesitated. She turned one last time, her gaze devoid of emotion. I'm never going to come back, Ruby. Her voice was steady, empty. I hope you have a nice life. And with that, she walked out. The moment the door clicked shut, I felt something snap inside me. A sharp, broken sob tore from my throat. I crumpled onto the bed, burying my face into the pillow, my shoulders shaking violently. Why? Why did I let her back in? I pressed a hand to my chest as if I could hold myself together. Then my phone rang. I sucked in a breath, wiping my tear-streaked face. I reached for it with trembling fingers. Richard. I let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Of course. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, I powered off my phone and collapsed back onto my bed, crying. The dull ache in my chest made it hard to move, but eventually, hunger won. My stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that I hadn't eaten since. I couldn't even remember when. With a heavy sigh, I pulled myself up, throwing on a random gown without bothering with underwear. What was the point? I barely had the energy to care. I grabbed my purse and stepped out, walking the short distance to the nearest store. The streets were quiet, the evening air thick with the scent of rain on hot pavements. I moved mechanically, buying 2 bottles of malt, instant noodles, and some biscuits. Things I didn't have to think too hard about. Back home, I set a pot of noodles on the stove, staring blankly as the flame flickered beneath it. My thoughts were a tangled mess, looping around the same questions, the same regrets. I was still lost in my haze when a soft knock came at my door, followed by the faint creak of it opening. I hadn't locked it. My heart jumped. I turned quickly, stepping into the sitting room, my pulse hammering in my ears. Richard. He stood at the doorway, one hand in his pocket, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on me. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Of all people. Are you feeling under the weather? He asked, his gaze flickering over me, up and down, taking in my disheveled state. I forced a faint smile and dropped onto the cushion, suddenly feeling drained again. I'm sorry I didn't come to work today. I I paused, my words tangling as I tried to find an excuse, tried to sound normal. I had some things I had to work on and I really didn't know how to. I stopped, realizing I was rambling. I swallowed hard and shook my head. I'm sorry. A lot has been happening lately. Richard nodded, his gaze shifting, subtly scanning the room. I felt my mind stall for a second, my stomach twisting. Could he smell it? The air still carried traces of last night. Could he tell? Before I could spiral further, Richard suddenly twitched his nose. What's that smell? He asked. My heart stopped. I stared at him, my skin turning cold. He knows. Oh God, he knows. What? I asked sharply, my voice coming out too quick, too panicked. His brow furrowed. Something is burning. I froze. The noodles. A bolt of panic shot through me as I whirled around, sprinting toward the kitchen. Richard was right behind me, his steps quick and firm. Thick smoke curled from the stove, filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt food. I quickly turned off the burner, grabbing the pot with trembling hands and tossing it into the sink. The lid rattled as I yanked it open, completely black, charred beyond saving. I exhaled shakily, my arms dropping to the counter, my head bowing as the weight of everything finally crashed down. I couldn't do this. My shoulders started shaking. My breath came out in short, broken gasps, and before I could stop myself, a sob tore from my throat. I pressed my hands against the sink, trying to steady myself, but the tears wouldn't stop. I was breaking. Richard stepped closer, his presence warm behind me. Then, gently, he placed his hands on my shoulders. Are you really okay? He asked, his voice softer than before. You can talk to me, Ruby. Is it financial issues? What is it? I sniffled, my body still trembling. His grip tightened slightly. Whatever it is, I can help you. I let out a shaky laugh, turning to face him, tears still running down my cheeks. You can? I whispered. He nodded, his dark eyes steady. I will do anything you want, Ruby. I'll go anywhere for you. My breath hissed. He reached up, his fingers grazing my cheek, wiping away the wetness. You are a very smart and intelligent woman, he murmured. Never forget that. My lips parted slightly, caught between disbelief and something else. You think so? I asked, smiling faintly through my tears. Richard's gaze softened, every word of it. And then he kissed me. It was slow, tentative at first, a careful offering, a quiet reassurance. I let myself melt into him. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. The way his touch felt solid, grounding, so different from the chaotic storm that Salome left behind. All I knew was that one moment we were standing in the kitchen, and the next we were in my room. The sheet still carried traces of last night, a reminder, but I ignored it. I let Richard hold me. I let him make me forget. I woke up expecting the usual cold shoulders, distant silence, and the casual detachment that I had become all too familiar with. But instead, I felt warmth, a gentle peck on my cheek. Good morning, sweet. Richard's deep voice rumbled beside me, a smile playing on his lips. I blinked at him, still processing. No regret, no rush to leave. I'd have to go to work in the same suit from yesterday, he added with a chuckle as he stretched, running a hand through his neatly trimmed hair. Hope no one notices. I let out a small, tired laugh. I think they will. He smirked. Well, let them. Maybe it's time they knew you are off the market. I sat up, watching him in quiet disbelief. This was different. Can I use your soap? He asked, already making his way to the bathroom. Yeah, sure, I replied, still trying to gauge his mood. As I heard the water start running, I exhaled slowly. Richard. He really wasn't a bad choice. He had been kind, reliable, steady, never treating me like a secret. This was normal, safe, everything I should want. So, why did it feel like I was convincing myself? We arrived at the office mid morning, and immediately the whispers began. The moment we walked in together, the air shifted, eyes turned, conversations slowed. I kept my head up, pretending not to notice. Richard was unfazed, walking with his usual confidence. As we passed by, his hand hovered lightly behind me, a small but deliberate gesture. At my desk, I could feel the weight of the unspoken thoughts around me. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw Kalista. She was already seated, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flickered toward me, then to Richard. Then, without a word, she looked away. I sighed. I don't have time for this girl's behavior today, I whispered to myself. By the time the office cleared out, I was still in Richard's office, my laptop open as we finalized a project. The air was crisp, the hum of the AC, the only sound between us. I glanced up at him, his sleeves rolled up, his brow furrowed in thought as he reviewed something on his screen. I exhaled slowly. He really was handsome. Low key, I'm scared of you getting that scholarship, he mused suddenly, breaking the silence. I raised a brow. Why? You travel to the States, he said with a teasing smile, and I wouldn't have access to you anymore. I smiled, shaking my head. I'm kidding, he added quickly. Your professional growth is my priority. One thing I really like about you, Ruby, is how focused and driven you are. You are not like other women looking for some man to leech on. That's very attractive. Something about his words made my chest tighten. Not in a bad way, just unexpected. I looked at him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us shifted, something unspoken hanging there. I swallowed, feeling a pull I didn't want to name. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze holding mine for a second longer than necessary. Then he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if reading my mind. We should wrap this up. It's getting late. I blinked, snapping back to reality. Yeah, you are right. And just like that, the moment passed. Richard pulled up in front of my apartment, shifting the car into park. He turned to me, his expression serious but steady. I want you to be mine, Ruby, he said. Exclusively mine. I inhaled sharply. Are you sure about that? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Of course I'm sure, he said, brows furrowing slightly. I'm not here to mess around with you. I meant it when I said I want to settle down. I sighed, rubbing my temples. There are things, Richard, things you don't really know about me. He frowned slightly. What's that about? Do you have some terrible disease? He gasped in mock horror. Am I safe? I laughed despite myself, shaking my head. I'm serious. So am I, he said, his voice softer now. Whatever it is, Ruby, it's in the past. I don't need to know about it. We all have a past. I just need to know that whatever happened has been put behind you, and that from today, we both remain committed to each other. I stared at him, stunned. This was everything I had wanted to hear from Salome. Everything Salome couldn't give me. He was choosing me, completely. without hesitation. He wasn't running away. Emotion swelled in my chest. I couldn't believe my ears. Oh, Richard, I whispered, grabbing his face in my hands. You are so sweet. You are sweeter, he murmured, leaning in. But this time, instead of pulling me in, he just smiled. Get some rest, he said, his voice warm. We'll talk tomorrow. And just like that, he was gone. That night, as I stood under the shower, I let the water wash over me, my thoughts spinning. I was really doing this. I was getting my life together with a man, with Richard. It was normal, safe, stable, everything I was supposed to want. And yet, as I climbed onto bed and stared at the ceiling, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling deep in my gut. If this was the right choice, why did it feel like I was lying to myself? Everything seemed to be going well for the remainder of the week. I had settled into this life, this new normal, and I was beginning to accept it for what it was. But then Sunday came. It had taken only 24 hours for me to fall back into my old routine. I sat in the wooden pews, hands clasped together in my lap, listening to Father Callistus deliver his sermon. His voice echoed through the church, steady and firm, but I wasn't really hearing it. I wasn't going to take communion again. I exhaled quietly, keeping my gaze fixed on the altar, but something made me glance behind me. There, a few rows back, was Kalista, alone. I frowned slightly. So she had come on her own today. I turned my gaze back to the priest, pretending I hadn't noticed her. I was sick of her mood swings. One minute she was warm and friendly, laughing at my jokes, and the next she was distant and cold, treating me like I had done something to upset her. What was her problem? I forced myself to focus on the mass. After service, I booked a cab to take me home. The moment I stepped outside the church gate, I pulled out my phone, pretending to check something, anything to avoid awkward interactions. Then, to my surprise, Kalista walked up to me. She stopped beside me, shifting on her feet like she was unsure of herself. She seemed calm this time. Here we go again, I thought, bracing myself. Hello, Ruby, she said finally, her voice soft. I turned to look at her, forcing a faint smile. Maybe it was time to mirror her own ridiculous behavior, to let her see how annoying her attitude had been. She smiled back nervously, then cleared her throat. You didn't take communion, she said after a pause. My brows furrowed. I don't understand. She scratched her arm, hesitating. We went for confession just last Sunday. I was just wondering if I turned to her fully this time, irritation creeping into my tone. I don't understand you, Kalista, I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. What business of it is this to you? She blinked, caught off guard by my sharp tone. I. I'm sorry, she said, her voice almost quivering. I sighed, shaking my head. Kalista, I don't like how you treat me. One day you are kind, the next you are acting like I stole something from you. She shook her head quickly. I'm really sorry, Ruby, she repeated, her voice small. I stared at her for a moment, feeling a strange mix of annoyance and guilt. Before I could respond, the taxi pulled up. She hesitated for a second, then asked, Can I join you? I let out a small sigh, feeling too tired to argue. You can do whatever you want, I muttered, sliding into the back seat. She followed quietly, shutting the door behind her. The air inside the taxi was thick with silence. For the first few minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional horns blaring from impatient Lagos drivers. I kept my gaze on the window, watching the city blur past, but I could feel her beside me, stealing hesitant glances in my direction. When we arrived at my place, she surprised me again. Did you cook anything? She asked casually. I turned to her, eyebrows raised. No. Why? She bit her lip, hesitating again. Then she asked, can I have a sleepover? Like the last time? I stared at her dumbfounded. Sleepover? Just like that? I shook my head slightly. Kalista, we could have planned this beforehand. I don't think I'm ready to entertain visitors right now. She sighed, biting her lips harder this time. I exhaled, rubbing my forehead. Maybe I had been too harsh. As the taxi pulled up in front of my house, I turned to her again. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I'm just really not in the mood today. She nodded slowly, but I could see the slight disappointment in her eyes. Then, out of nowhere, something clicked in my mind. Maybe you need me emotionally too, I thought suddenly, just like I needed you that Sunday. I studied her expression carefully. Is there something on your mind you want to share with me? I asked. She nodded. I leaned back slightly. All right, I said, watching her carefully. Let's talk. That afternoon, Kalista and I found ourselves in the kitchen, working in quiet harmony as we prepared egusi soup and fufu. The rich aroma of melon seeds, palm oil, and smoked fish filled the small space, making my stomach grumble in anticipation. You know, I said, stirring the pot. Sundays were always rice days when I lived with my parents. Kalista chuckled, using the back of a spoon to check the consistency of the fufu. Same. If it wasn't jollof, it was fried rice. My mom said anything else was breaking tradition. I laughed lightly. It almost feels like a crime eating something different today. The soup was finally ready and I ladled some into a bowl. I don't have more than one bowl for soup, I said, holding it up. You don't mind sharing with me, right? Kalista shrugged. It's fine. We settled down in the sitting room, plates in hand, tearing into the meal with practiced ease. The first few bites were silent, both of us too hungry to speak. But eventually, I decided to press forward. So, I began, dipping my fufu into the thick soup. What is it you wanted to share with me? Kalista hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the spoon, and she quickly took a sip of water as if stalling. Then she did something strange. She pushed her plate toward me. I think I'm done with the food, she said abruptly. You can have the last morsel. I stared at her. Was she trying to avoid the conversation? Kalista, I sighed, setting my plate down. You do this all the time. Do what? She asked, her voice too neutral to be genuine. Change the subject when things get serious. She simply shook her head. I just don't have an appetite anymore. I let it go. For now. We turned our attention to the TV, watching a Tales by Emailer video on YouTube, one of my favorite storytelling channels that used AI generated visuals to bring stories to life. Her stories are good, Kalista said, her focus entirely on the screen. I sighed, nodding. Yeah, they are. I watch her a lot. As the video ended, she let out a small groan, stretching her arms dramatically. I'm feeling a bit drowsy, she muttered. I ate too much fufu. I smirked. That's your fault. She chuckled, rubbing the back of her head. Then suddenly, can you come with me? I turned to her, brows furrowing in confusion. Come with you, where? To your room, she said softly. I want to tell you something, privately. A strange feeling stirred in my stomach, but curiosity won. Okay, I said, standing up. Let's go. Inside my room, I sat on the bed, feeling slightly awkward as Kalista joined me. She sat a little too close, her body angled toward mine, her knee barely brushing against mine. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. Then she finally spoke. Are you and Mr. Richard really serious? She asked, watching me closely. I blinked. Um, yeah. Her eyes darkened slightly. Like, serious, serious? She pressed. I smiled nervously. Yeah, we are official. For a brief second, her face faltered, like I had said something she didn't want to hear. Then another question. And do you still find women attractive? I inhaled sharply, feeling the shift in the air. What is this about? I asked, my tone tinged with irritation. Are we here to talk about me or about you? Kalista sighed, rubbing her palms together as if nervous. It's important, she murmured. I need to know how you take what I'm about to tell you. Something in her voice sent a chill down my spine. I shifted uncomfortably. I broke up with someone, and now I'm with Mr. Richard. When? Calista bit her lip hesitatingly. I stood up, exasperated. I don't understand, I muttered. What are you trying to say? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Just say it, Calista, I urged. I'm getting impatient. Sorry. And then, just like that, she shut down. Never mind, she said abruptly, standing up. I frowned. Calista, maybe this was a bad idea. She cut me off, her voice clipped, tense. Before I could react, she grabbed her purse and walked toward the door. I guess I'll see you at work tomorrow. And with that, she left. I stood there, staring at the closed door, my mind racing. Very difficult to deal with, I muttered under my breath, rubbing my temples. That night, as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, my phone buzzed. I reached for it, groggy and irritated, ready to ignore it. Then I saw the name, Kalista. I let out a heavy sigh. Was she going to delete it again? I hesitated. Then, deciding I'd better read it this time before she erased it, I opened the message. Ruby, I know you probably won't read this, or maybe you will and pretend you didn't. Either way, I need to say this before it eats me alive. I don't understand you sometimes. One minute, you act like I'm someone important to you. The next, you are distant, like I don't even exist. I keep telling myself that maybe that's just how you are, that you are dealing with your own demons, that you need space. But the truth is, Ruby, I'm tired. I'm tired of always being the one who reaches out, the one who cares more, the one who waits for you to realize I'm right here. I wasn't going to say this, but screw it. I like you, okay? I have feelings for you, and I have for a while now. But you're too busy chasing other people. Do you know how it feels to sit across from you, laughing, joking, pretending like I don't wish you would just look at me and notice my emotions? When you are hurting, I want to be the one you turn to. When you are happy, I want to be the one who makes you smile. But I guess it's my fault for hoping. Maybe it's my fault for thinking that if I stayed long enough, if I was patient enough, you'd finally see me. But I get it now. You never will. I won't do this to myself anymore, Ruby. I won't sit around waiting for you to decide that I'm worth your love. I'm done waiting. I'm done hoping. I'm done pretending that being your friend is enough. I wish you happiness, truly, but I can't keep breaking my own heart over you. Take care. I stared at the message, dumbfounded. What in the world was this one talking about?